Just grow. Hello again, everybody, and welcome back to my channel. My name is Sarah, and today we are talking about what to do if your plant won't grow. Before we jump into today's video, take a moment, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button if you're interested in receiving more plant-related content. So lately I've been seeing a lot of questions floating around the internet about what to do if your plant looks a certain way, how to kind of diagnose different problems with plants. And so I thought I would start a little series of kind of like a plant prescription, what to do, what to look for in a certain plant, and maybe some steps that you can take if you're seeing your plant behaving in a certain way. Each video, I will go ahead and address one issue and some steps that you can take to go ahead and try to fix whatever issue you think you're seeing in your plant. If you have specific questions that you would like answered as part of this video series, go ahead and leave those down in the comments below. I'll try to answer them. Especially think broad and general questions, not my plant specifically is doing this, but what to do if you're noticing yellow leaves, for instance, or maybe if you notice a certain pest. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into today's video. Like I said, today's topic is going to be what to do if you notice that your plant isn't necessarily growing. And this would be, it's not growing, it's not putting out any new leaves, but it's also not getting any worse. It's just kind of stagnant. And I know this happens quite a bit. And so I thought I'd talk about kind of what to look for and what you can do if that is the case with your plant. So my first piece of advice anytime you're wanting to change anything with your plant is to not make every single change at once. I know it can be tempting to want to do everything that you think might be wrong, moving the plant to a new location, giving it food, all sorts of things. But if you do everything at once, you're not going to narrow down what this plant's specific care requirements are. And in fact, you might actually overwhelm the plant changing too many things at once. So think about making one, maybe two small changes depending on what you want to do with this plant. But think about really narrowing it down. Can you change one thing at a time, give it a couple weeks, see how that's working, and then if that's not improving anything, make another small change. Go down your list of things one at a time, really settling in what are the care requirements for this specific plant. The next thing to take into consideration with any plant are any recent life changes with this plant. So if it's not putting on any new growth, if it's just being stagnant, maybe have there been any major life changes recently? That could include that you just received the plant, you brought it home from the nursery, which is super warm, super humid, like ideal plant environment. Maybe you had it shipped to you and it had to go through a few days in that dark box to get to you. And maybe you had to repot it for whatever reason, maybe just changing out the medium, some root rot, whatever it happens to be. So a great example of a plant like this in my home is my Hoya shepherdi. I got this quite a while ago, earlier, probably this summer, and it just hasn't done anything since it's come home to me. It has not put on any new growth, any new leaves, anything. It's starting to just barely put out a little tiny bit of new growth just now. I've had it underneath a grow light, but really it was not doing anything for me. Another example of this is I had a Hoya carnosa that was just two leaves, wasn't growing, wasn't doing any worse, just wasn't growing. And when I went to go convert my Hoya carnosa into semi-hydroponics, I pulled it out of the dirt and there was just this huge, massive root system that had formed. And that can very often be the case with your plants, especially if they've gone through some sort of transplanting, repotting, again, maybe shipping. They might just be taking a second to put on some roots before they start putting out new growth. They're growing down into the soil, into the medium, into the pot, getting that root system firmly established, and then they'll go ahead and start to put out a little bit of new growth for you. So if it's not getting any worse and it just went through a life change, maybe just chill on it, give it a second, see if it's putting on any new roots, and then eventually maybe after a little while it will start to put on some new growth for you. The next thing to take into consideration is the season where you are at. A lot of plants go a little bit more dormant. They tend to not put on as much growth during the winter months. And you might think, well, they're in my house, the temperature stays pretty much the same. But there can be a lot of things that can trigger a plant to go dormant. Maybe if it's colder outside, even though you set your thermostat to the same temperature, if they're close to a window or a wall, they might actually be getting a little bit of that cold snap. And not enough to harm the plant, but just enough to trigger it to say, hey, maybe don't put on any new growth. Same thing with the amount of light that they're getting. If they're not underneath a grow light, and sometimes even if they are, they still just know that it is wintertime. They're not getting as much light. The days are shorter. And so again, if they're not getting any worse, they may just be kind of going dormant for a little bit and just not putting on any new growth until spring. There are actually several plants that really exhibit this. Alocasias are one. In my home, alocasias are just not putting on any new growth right now, and in fact are losing some of those older leaves. They can actually go dormant all the way down to the bulb in some cases. Same thing with caladiums. They can die all the way back, just the bulbs, and then put on a little bit of new growth come spring. So if that's the case for your plant, whether it dies back completely or maybe it's just not putting on any new growth, look into the fact, hey, maybe it's winter time, maybe I just need to take a step back, let it be, water it a little less, feed it a little less, and then come spring, it will go ahead and put out a bunch of new growth. The next thing that you might start to consider changing if your plant isn't doing anything is moving it a little bit closer to the light, whether that's putting it under a grow light, maybe it's a little further away from a window and you'd like to put it in a little bit more brighter sunlight, maybe even a little bit of direct sunlight depending on the plant. So if it's not putting out any new growth, and again, it's not necessarily getting any worse, you might consider just the amount of light that it's getting. The other thing that might be affecting that, if it's done really well historically in that particular spot, you might check the leaves, especially on big plants like my Monstera behind me. If there's a lot of dust on those leaves, it may be getting the same amount of light, but not able to process as much of that with the chlorophyll because of the dust on the leaves. So just take that into account. It does need that light to convert in order to create energy, in order to give you that new growth. So maybe giving it just a little bit more light. It doesn't have to be taking it from, a dark corner all the way to bright direct sunlight, but moving it a little bit closer to the light and seeing if that triggers a little bit of new growth for you. The next thing to consider, I'm going to kind of tie two things together here, is the amount of water and the amount of humidity that this plant is getting. And I'm tying them together because it would be so easy to say, well, just give it a little bit more water and it's going to put on new growth. But I don't want you to think like, just start overwatering this plant. But it is something to take into account if you know that you've been watering it. And again, it's just kind of like staying stagnant. Maybe it's getting just enough water to stay alive, but not enough to actually go ahead and push out any new growth. So just notice how often you're watering it. Maybe notice if it needs a little tiny bit more water. Don't go overboard with that. And the other reason that a little bit more water might help is the amount of humidity surrounding that plant. And this could be also, you could put a pebble tray, you could put humidifiers. Some plants, especially if you notice it's starting to put out a new leaf, but that new leaf won't open, some plants need higher humidity in order to go ahead and shoot out those new leaves and open them. So again, depending on the amount of extra humidity it needs, a little tiny bit more water might kind of increase that ambient humidity around the plant, or you might try an external means, something like a humidifier, a pebble tray, even putting like some plastic, putting it in like a terrarium or a plastic bag to increase that humidity. See if that will help to boost a little bit of new growth for you. The next thing that you might look at, and I'm putting it towards the end of my list on purpose, is the amount of food that your plant is getting. Now, I put it towards the end because the temptation is to just rush right in and say, oh, my plant's not growing, I'm going to feed it more, and then it will give me new growth. But the problem is you might actually be overfeeding and burning those roots and causing more problems to that plant. It's such an easy, first thing that you think of. I'm actually putting it way down towards the end of the list. So if you've looked at a couple couple of these other elements and that's not fixing it for you, you might take into consideration when was the last time that you fed this plant. They can go for quite a while without food, especially if there are those little pellets that the nursery puts in there. Maybe you repotted it recently and it's in a fresh medium. Those kinds of things, it may not need that food for a while. But if you're thinking to yourself, this plant's not growing and it's been about 6 or 7 months without food, that might be a time in which you consider maybe a little like really diluted amount of food and see if it will help to trigger a little bit of new growth. I also really love that Super Thrive. I put that in my plants all the time, and most of the time I see that helps to trigger a little bit of new growth in plants that maybe we're just lacking in a little bit of nutrients. And your very last resort to check and see with these kind of stagnant plants, this also can go for plants that are just generally not doing well and you're not quite sure why. This happened with my fiddle leaf fig. It's to go in and check the roots and really like see what's happening in your plant. Now, this can disturb your plant and it can cause a little bit more damage and then go back to step one of it stagnates and it won't grow and it has to put out new roots. But if you've checked all these other things, you're playing around, or you just notice like generally like it's not doing well, you might get in there and check the roots. It could be one of two things. It could be that it is root bound and it's just getting enough water, enough nutrients, just enough to keep it alive, but not enough to put out any new growth. So if it's root bound, repotting it sometimes can help it explode with a little bit. It's got space to expand, right? It can put on a little bit of new growth. The other thing that happened with my fiddle leaf fig is I got in there and I realized there was a root plug in there. What happens sometimes at the nurseries is they plant them in these little tiny little mesh things when they're starting them from just a tiny baby little plant. When they go to repot them to a bigger pot size in order to grow them big to sell them in the stores, especially all nurseries are guilty of this, but especially big box stores, which is where I got my fiddle leaf fig, that root plug stays in there. They don't do anything to it. And it starts to grow around, but at some point, the roots that are in there are just getting so stagnated and they're caught up in this little tiny mesh plug. And when you get in there and you break it out, you've got suddenly all these new roots that now have space to go. Now, the caveat to that is that it's going to bump you back to square one, right? So after I did that and I repotted my fiddle leaf fig, actually it was 2 fiddle leaf figs, both had the root plugs on them. One died completely, but the other one, it just, again, it wasn't doing anything. It just sat there and I'm like, I just can't handle fiddle leaf figs. They're too much for me. And just recently, about a month and a half ago, it started putting on new growth. It has put on probably 3 or 4 new leaves in the space of that month and a half. So what it was doing was it was sending out those new roots. It was establishing itself in the soil, and it was just kind of staying stagnant on the top, and the root system was growing. And now finally it's got enough of a root system that it's going, hey, let's boost out some new growth now. So if you're a little bit desperate, you've tried a bunch of other things, again, maybe there's just this general sense like everything else is right, but this plant just isn't doing well, you might get in there and check the root system. Just be aware that that is like a last resort. You don't want to shock your plant or cause any damage to the roots that could set it back even further. And one final piece of advice would be to just not compare your plant to what you're seeing on the internet, especially looking on Instagram or comparing it to what other people's plants are doing. Everybody's homes are a little bit different. They might be getting a different amount of light. They might keep it set at a different level. Things like that. So if your plant isn't growing as fast as maybe somebody else's is, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're doing something wrong. It might just mean that their home environment, their care is a little bit different than yours, and they might get a little more growth on one plant, a little less growth on another. Everybody's home environment is a little bit different, so don't go changing a ton of stuff just because you saw a plant on Instagram and they're getting 3 new leaves every single day and you have only gotten 1 new leaf in the past month. That might not mean you just might not have to change anything. It could just be a difference in the environment itself. So I hope you guys found this super helpful. If you did, leave a like, leave a comment down below. If you have any specific questions that you would like me to answer as part of kind of this plant prescription series, let me know in the comments down below. Again, the more general the question, hey, what do I do if my plant does this, and not specific to, hey, look at my leaves on this particular plant. Let me know that in the comments and I will try my best to make a video about it and answer it. Thanks again so much for watching, and I will see you guys again with another video very soon. Bye.